The command from the loudspeaker sliced through the cold night air with the kind of authority that made the entire highway feel suddenly smaller. Turn the engine off and step out of the vehicle slowly. The red and blue lights behind me didn't just flash, they flooded the interior of my sedan like a storm of violent colors, crimson and sapphire reflections bouncing across the windshield, crawling across the dashboard, and trembling against my hands gripping the steering wheel. I didn't bother checking the rearview mirror because I already knew the situation was bad. Multiple cruisers. High-risk stop. Guns probably drawn. My pulse should have been racing, my breathing should have been shallow, but instead there was a strange calm spreading through my chest, the kind of calm that only appears when your mind accepts something irreversible. I turned the ignition key and the engine died, leaving behind only the ticking sound of hot metal cooling under the rain that had just started to fall. "Show me your hands," the officer shouted again through the megaphone, his voice echoing across the empty stretch of asphalt. Slowly, I raised both hands above the steering wheel where the lights could see them. The door creaked as I pushed it open from the outside, stepping onto the gravel shoulder while the cold wind slapped against my face. 3 spotlights locked onto me instantly, turning the world into blinding white beams that erased everything except the silhouettes of officers crouched behind cruiser doors with their weapons aimed directly at my chest. A red laser dot jittered against my jacket. "Turn around. Hands behind your head. Walk backwards toward my voice." Every command came sharp and precise, the language of people trained to expect violence. I obeyed without hesitation, fingers interlocking behind my head as I stepped backward across the wet pavement. The rain tapped against the road like static while the lead officer rushed forward and slammed me against the hood of my own car. The metal was freezing under my cheek as the handcuffs snapped around my wrists with a hard mechanical click. "You're under arrest for felony hit and run resulting in severe bodily injury," the officer said, his voice tight with anger as he began the Miranda warning. Somewhere in the city, a family was in an ambulance, their vehicle destroyed at an intersection, and according to every piece of evidence the police had found so far, I was the person responsible. The strange thing was that the accusation didn't shock me. I already knew why this was happening. My older brother, Adrian Cole, had spent 30 years being the center of my parents' universe, the reckless golden child who could destroy anything and still walk away clean because our parents were always there to erase the damage. When Adrian crashed his car drunk at 19, the charges vanished after my father made a few phone calls. When he lost 2 different jobs for gambling debts, my mother quietly paid the money and told everyone he had resigned voluntarily. I was the opposite, the quiet one who moved away, built a stable life, and became a cyber forensics analyst for a private logistics company where my job was literally to reconstruct the truth from digital evidence. For years I barely spoke to my family until 3 days ago when my mother called and insisted on a reconciliation dinner, claiming Adrian had changed and the family wanted to reconnect before his upcoming engagement party. I should have recognized the performance immediately because during that dinner Adrian hugged me in a long emotional embrace that at the time felt strange but harmless. Now I understood that while he had been pretending to cry on my shoulder, he had slipped his hand into my coat pocket and stolen my driver's license. At exactly 9:32 tonight, Adrian had been driving his girlfriend's luxury SUV while drunk, blasting through a red light downtown and smashing into a small sedan carrying a couple who were simply driving home from dinner. Witnesses said the driver stumbled out of the SUV, looked at the wreckage, then ran into the darkness of a nearby alley. When the police searched the abandoned vehicle, they found my license on the floor near the driver's seat. 10 minutes later, an anonymous caller reported seeing a woman matching my description running away from the crash site, and 20 minutes after that a patrol unit located my car on the highway and initiated the stop that had just ended with steel cuffs cutting into my wrists. Somewhere across town, my parents and Adrian were probably sitting in their enormous living room feeling relieved that the disaster had been successfully redirected toward the expendable child who lived far enough away that his disappearance wouldn't ruin the family reputation. The cruiser door slammed shut as the officer shoved me into the back seat and the vehicle began moving through the rain-soaked streets toward the precinct, neon signs bleeding across the window like melting paint while my mind worked with cold mechanical precision. They believed they had framed me perfectly using physical evidence, but the modern world doesn't run on fingerprints and eyewitnesses anymore. It runs on data. Every smartphone, smartwatch, security camera, traffic sensor, And cellular tower constantly records fragments of reality that can be reconstructed by someone who understands the architecture behind them. And unfortunately for my family, reconstructing digital truth was exactly what I had spent the last 8 years doing professionally. By the time the cruiser rolled into the underground garage of the central precinct and the officers pulled me out to march me through the fluorescent-lit bullpen toward the interrogation rooms, my fear had completely disappeared. In its place was something far more dangerous. Because while the police believed they had just arrested the suspect responsible for the crash, what they had actually done was deliver the only person capable of proving the entire conspiracy directly into the center of the investigation. And the moment I got access to my confiscated phone, the carefully constructed lie my family had built was going to collapse in ways they had never even imagined. The interrogation room felt smaller than the patrol car that had brought me here, a square concrete box washed in pale fluorescent light that hummed quietly overhead while the air smelled like stale coffee and disinfectant, the kind of room designed to make people uncomfortable enough to talk, but I sat calmly with my wrist cuffed to the steel ring bolted into the center of the table, listening to the distant noise of phones ringing and officers moving through the hallway outside, knowing the detectives were probably watching me through the two-way mirror trying to decide what kind of suspect they were dealing with because most people arrested for a violent hit-and-run either panic, cry, or start inventing desperate lies. But I did none of those things. I simply waited with a quiet patience that probably made them more suspicious than any outburst could have. And after nearly 40 minutes the heavy door finally opened and a detective stepped inside carrying a folder and a paper cup of coffee, his jacket slightly wrinkled like someone who had been called into work unexpectedly, his tired eyes scanning me carefully before he sat down across the table and opened the folder with slow deliberate movements. "My name is Detective Harris," he said in a voice that sounded practiced and skeptical at the same time, "and you're going to tell me why your driver's license was found inside the SUV that nearly killed 2 people tonight." I watched him place the plastic evidence bag on the table containing my license, and he leaned back waiting for the reaction he expected, maybe tears or anger or the classic line about calling a lawyer, but instead I looked at the bag calmly and then back at him. "That depends," I said quietly. "Do you want the short explanation or the accurate one?" The detective frowned slightly because that wasn't the answer he had prepared for, and he flipped open the folder showing photographs of the wrecked intersection, the smashed front of the SUV, the crushed sedan that had been pushed halfway across the road by the impact. "At 9:32 tonight," he began, "a black Mercedes registered to a local property developer ran a red light at 60 miles an hour and slammed into another vehicle carrying 2 civilians who are currently in the hospital. The driver fled the scene leaving behind this license, and an anonymous witness reported seeing someone matching your description running away." He paused, letting the accusation settle in the room before leaning forward. "So here's your opportunity to help yourself before the charges become permanent." For a moment the room was silent except for the buzz of the fluorescent light above us, then I exhaled slowly and nodded toward the cardboard box of my personal belongings sitting near the wall. "Inside that box," I said calmly, "is my phone and my smartwatch. And if you allow me to access them for exactly 3 minutes, I can prove that the person who committed that crash was not me." The detective gave a dry laugh like someone who had heard every excuse imaginable during his career. "You expect me to hand a suspect their phone during an interrogation," he said, "and believe whatever app you show me." I shrugged slightly despite the cuff pulling at my wrist. "You don't have to believe me, detective, but if you don't check the data you're about to charge the wrong person while the actual driver is sitting comfortably somewhere else." He studied my expression for a long moment, trying to detect whether I was bluffing, but apparently the confidence in my voice made him hesitate because after a few seconds he stood up, stepped outside the room, and spoke quietly with someone beyond the door before returning with the box and placing it on the table. 3 minutes, he said while unlocking the cuff from the ring but leaving it around my wrist. "And if you try anything besides showing me evidence, the phone goes back in the box." I nodded once and reached inside, retrieving the device, the screen lighting up under my fingerprint as I opened a health monitoring application connected to the smartwatch still strapped to my arm. Then I slid the phone across the table so he could see the graph displayed across the screen. "At the exact moment that crash happened," I explained calmly, "my heart rate was 57 beats per minute and my location data shows I was inside my apartment building nearly 12 miles away." The detective leaned closer, studying the graph, which clearly displayed a steady resting pattern with GPS markers attached to each minute of recorded data. You could have left the watch at home, he said cautiously, and I nodded again because I had anticipated that argument. That's correct, which is why we should check the building security system next, I replied while opening another application that connected to my apartment complex cloud storage. Within seconds the screen displayed camera footage from the lobby showing me entering the building earlier that evening and never leaving afterward, the timestamp visible in the corner, the detective's expression shifting slightly as he realized the alibi was becoming harder to dismiss, but I wasn't finished yet. However, I continued while typing rapidly. The real proof isn't about where I was, it's about where the SUV was and who was actually inside it. I accessed a database through a secure portal belonging to the logistics company I worked for, a system that monitored vehicle telemetry for corporate clients including the real estate firm that owned the crashed Mercedes. The detective watched silently as lines of data loaded across the screen showing GPS coordinates, acceleration patterns, and driver authentication logs recorded by the vehicle's internal systems. Modern fleet vehicles store a surprising amount of information, I explained, rotating the phone so he could read the highlighted section, including the identity of the person who unlocked the car using their biometric key. The detective leaned closer again and read the name displayed in the log entry, his eyebrows lifting slightly as he recognized it, because the person listed as the driver at 9:32 p.m. was not me but Adrian Cole, my brother, whose biometric key had activated the vehicle minutes before the crash and whose phone had remained connected to the car's Bluetooth system until the moment he abandoned it 2 blocks away. The detective sat back slowly absorbing the implication that the case he believed was already solved had just been flipped upside down by digital evidence he couldn't easily dismiss. If that's true, he said quietly, then your brother ran from the scene and someone placed your license inside the vehicle. I nodded while locking the phone and placing it back on the table. Which means someone deliberately tried to frame me, I replied. And the room fell silent again as the detective stared at the screen where the final piece of data remained visible, a time-stamped record showing the exact moment Adrian's phone disconnected from the vehicle seconds after the crash, proving beyond reasonable doubt that he had been the one behind the wheel, and somewhere across the city my parents were probably still sitting comfortably in their living room believing their plan had succeeded, completely unaware that the digital trail they assumed nobody would ever check had just rewritten the entire investigation. And as Detective Harris slowly reached for his radio to call the traffic unit handling the crash scene, I realized that the trap they had built for me had quietly reversed direction, and by morning the police wouldn't be looking for the anonymous woman who fled the wreck anymore. They would be knocking on the front door of my parents' house asking for Adrian Cole, the real driver who thought he had escaped the consequences of one more reckless night.